after that initial blush of success that you were just talking about with the Brat Pack and all that stuff sort of started, I started traveling the world. I mentioned I walked across the Camino de Santiago, and I had a real white light experience that first time I did it. In this field of wheat, I just found myself on my knees sobbing. And I realized in that moment how much fear had dominated my life. Travel is a powerful, meaningful tool, and it can change your life in a profound way like it's changed mine.
Hey everyone, welcome to How Success Happens. I'm Dan Bova, writer and editor at entrepreneur.com. And if you are a Gen Xer like me, today's guest likely played a huge part in your teenage movie-going experience. Andrew McCarthy starred in such iconic flicks as Pretty in Pink, St. Elmo's Fire, Mannequin, Less Than Zero, Weekend at Bernie's, but he's expanded his resume to travel writer, TV director, and New York Times best-selling author. He's here today to talk about his latest book, Who Needs Friends? An Unscientific Examination of Male Friendship Across America, which is out now. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Great to talk to you. We talk so much on this show about the power of our personal networks, and not just from a what can this person do for me angle, but having a support system to help manage the highs and lows of life. So I was really eager to talk to you about this new book. Can you talk a little bit about how it came about and what it's about?
Yeah, sure. I was sitting at the kitchen table a few years ago. My son was just sitting there strumming his guitar, telling me a funny story about one of his friends. He finished his story and he kind of looked up at me and said, "You don't really have any friends, do you, Dad?" And he was 20 years old at the time. And he didn't mean it in any kind of nasty. It was just the way kids sort of speak directly to something, you know? And I said, "Yeah, Sammy, I do have friends. I just don't see them, but I know they're there, and that's enough." And he kind of went, "Yeah, okay." And he went off to see his girlfriend or whatever. And I sat with that for a little while, and I thought, you know what? It's not enough. And, like many of us, I had, when I was a young man, his age, my early 20s, and I had this group of several close, dear friends who became they were like my chosen family, the way we get when we first leave home. And they were instrumental in me becoming who I've become, through life and families and jobs or whatever, they all moved away. And I hadn't seen them in years and years, decades sometimes. And I just thought I need to go see my friends. So I got in the car and I drove 10,000 miles across America on back roads. And I just went to reconnect with my old friends. And along the way, I actually became very interested in the topic, and I started talking to men. I just randomly would approach guys on the street or in a gas station or in a bar, and I would say, "Hey, man, would you talk to me about your friends?" And they all looked at me like I was nuts. And then, but what's interesting, after they all kind of settled down for a minute, they went, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And not a single guy said no to me. Every single guy talked to me. And invariably, when I would finish my conversation with them, they would look at me and kind of go, "I've never talked about this before. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
I've never talked about this. So thank you." And they end up thanking me.
That is amazing. And there's a lot of I want to get into with that. And I'm curious just from your standpoint, because, as we talked minutes before we started recording here, I have two sons, and they're one's in 22 and one's 19. And I'm always amazed when I see them interacting with their friends because they're really nice to each other. And I feel like, I don't know if it was just my generation or what, but we were such sarcastic assholes to each other all the time. And I wonder, do you see that? Do you see that this is sort of an issue for the older folks?
Well, I find the same thing with my kids now that you mention it that way. They are sort of kinder to each other. And so when it was interesting too, when I talk to people across the country, whenever I would talk to young people, they were really forthcoming with me. Like I'd ask everybody, I said, "You ever get lonely?" And all the young guys would say, "Oh yeah, yeah, I get lonely a lot." And whenever I'd ask an older guy, my age or some, they'd go, "No, I don't get lonely." And I always know when I answer a question too fast like that, it's either a topic I'm afraid of or I'm lying. And
Right.
it's so interesting that the younger people were so much more willing to admit their loneliness than the older guys were. Um, anyhow, so that's interesting you point that out. I hadn't thought about that before, but I think it's really true. My kids are sort of much nicer to their friends than we were.
Yeah.
We were
uh,
always flagging each other and just that was like how you communicated, right?
yeah, yeah, that was our language. Well, so now that you've, completed, you wrote a book about it, like what are your kind of main takeaways about, aside from, I think we can all recognize whether we want to admit it. I'm sitting here alone, I'm kind of lonely. But what are some of the other like big takeaways that you found?
Well, one of the great experiences I had in doing it was that as I drove and reconnected with one friend and then the next, and I sensed this sort of emotional safety net underneath me sort of developing that I hadn't realized I'd been living without as I'd been, being provider and all that kind of stuff. And that was a really kind of safe feeling that I experienced from just reconnecting with my friends in that way. So anyway, that was sort of for me a big personal thing. But one of the big takeaways I had was that every guy I talked to, without exception, the dominating factor in their life was the need to provide. They felt a need that they have to provide. And when I would explain, my wife is wildly capable, more capable than I am in many ways. And when I explained this to her, she said, like, well, that's ridiculous. We can all help each other. I'm like, no. With a guy, and every guy I talked to about it, I go, do you feel this? And their answer is just simply, of course, of course. And just to even acknowledge that with another guy, for me, it was just such a relief because I didn't even really know I felt it that much until I would chat about it with each person I talked to. Did you feel this need to provide? I go, dude, are you kidding? That's all I feel. And I did find that every guy I talked to was surprised to talk about this topic, that most guys had never talked. I met guys who've been
Mm,
friends for 50, 60 years. I met these cops in Ohio. They're in their 70s. They've been friends since they're 12, best friends. And they said, this is the first time we've ever talked about our friendship. We've been best friends for 60 years and we've never talked about our friendship before. And, I thought that was amazing. I mean, we just don't have the vocabulary or the interest. Like my wife and her friends are always talking about their relationship and their friendship
yeah.
and discussing it. Whereas, like, we just don't do that. I also, as I went across country, a lot of guys trapped by this sort of macho idea of what manhood is, which is, we carry our own water. You don't tell anybody. You do it alone. Pull your hat down. Get it done. And I think that emotionally is just really isolating because guys, we don't want to admit we're vulnerable because if you admit vulnerability, that is perceived in many ways as weakness. And the one thing a man can never be or present is weakness. I met this guy when I was in Texas. I was in West Texas on my journey, and he was riding a motorcycle across town, and we were across the state, and we were just staying at this motel, and we were the only two guests in this motel in this tiny town of Comstock, like 120 people. And so we started chatting, and he's tinkering with his bike, and I'm just sitting outside chatting with the sun going down, and he says, "Yeah, I'm out here. I got a big decision to make in life, and I go out and ride and let the road tell me what to do in life." And like, I was like, okay, and I could just hear a real pride, and I'm not mocking. I mean, that worked for him, but I could hear a real pride in that sense of I do this alone, and
Yeah.
I pull in, and that's how it gets done. And I
Right.
have to say, I'm not sure that's the best way for all of us to be doing things or decisions to be made because you can justify an awful lot in your head alone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a good
Yeah.
friend would go to me, my good friend go, Andrew, what are you thinking there, dude? I'm not sure that's really what you want to be doing.
Right.
You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, yeah, and we talk about it a lot all the time. When it comes to starting a business, talking to people, mentors, people who have done this before you, and maybe they can see some missteps you're about to make and help you make some better decisions based on their experiences. So I think all these things go together.
of course, and I think we don't do that, I think maybe for two reasons because we don't know to do it because it's not our habit, or we're afraid of what they will tell us. They're afraid that we're going to tell us we're wrong. And
Right, right,
you know what I mean? But you have to be, if you're really going to take it and want something to succeed, you have to be willing to hear that you're wrong.
right.
You know what I mean? And too
Absolutely.
many of us would rather just not hear that and go on our own thing and just go blindly down this path when a little information and a little sort of, it doesn't mean I'm no good and I shouldn't do this idea and I shouldn't do this. It just means that, wait a minute, here's somebody who's down that road a little further who might be able to go, you want to go left there. Just be careful because there's a thing there. You want to stay to the left of it. I'm like, oh, yeah. And to be able to accept that, it's like guys won't ask for directions. It's ludicrous. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the simplest thing in the world, and yet it's a cliche and a joke, but it's absolutely true. And I did it with my wife not long ago. She goes, "Can we just ask him?" I go, "No, I got this." And I'm like, what was I doing? What was I thinking? Why did I need to prove? It wasn't some emasculating thing to ask for help, And
Yeah.
I think that is a real masculine thing of not asking for help. Anyway.
Well, you are a big go out and discover things kind of guy. Before this book, you wrote Walking with Sam, which was a 5 week, 500-mile trek you took with your son. I couldn't get my son when he was in high school, which is like I could throw a rock at it. I couldn't get him to walk to school and had to drive him every day. So, how do you get your son to go on a 500-mile trek?
Well, that walk, driving to school together every day is actually the best thing in the world for your relationship, right? I mean, I think it's a pain in the ass, but it's great to just, particularly if you're in a car, you don't have to look at each other and you can kind of look out the window and go, yeah, I don't know about whatever. What do you mean? You know what I mean? You get these little things, these little flares get sent up. But yeah, we walked the old Camino de Santiago, which is an ancient pilgrimage route across Spain. And I'd walked it 30 years ago as a young man, and I'd always wanted to do it again. And my son, he was actually 19 at the time, and he was just sort of going to go out in the world. And my relationship with my dad had kind of ended when I left home. And for all my heart, I did not want that to happen with my son. And so his girlfriend had just broken up with him and he was moping around the house and I got him in a very weak moment. And I said, "Hey, Sammy, why don't we go walk across Spain?" And he was like, "Yeah, whatever." So I literally went into the other room. He was moping around. I literally went in the other room, bought 2 tickets, and 2 days later, I had him walking across Spain. Because if he should have, by the time he looked up, he was like, "What?" And truly, and on day two, you'll relate. You've got these kids these age. On day two, he says to me, "Dad, what's the point of this fucking walk?" And when we get there, at the end, a month later, we finally pull into Santiago 500 miles later, and he looks at me and says, "Dad, that is the only 10 out of 10 thing I've ever done in my life."
Wow.
And what it did for our relationship was that my relationship ended with my dad when I left home, basically, until very late in his life when we kind of reconciled. And I was waiting always for the day my son would sort of wake up and just want nothing to do with me. And it helped me realize that the degree at which I was doing that was sort of overcompensating. And I just stopped doing that. I let him see who I was as a person separate from him, as an adult, as a person in my own life. And I started to see him as a separate person and as an adult, and that where could we meet as adults.
So how did you discover travel as this, big such a big part of your life? Obviously, most of us got to know you, as I said in the beginning, as an actor in a lot of extremely popular movies. And we talk about on this show a lot of pivoting, like trying something new, trying something that scares us. How did you find your way into travel writing?
Well, it was interesting because that's sort of like how long's a piece of string, that answer. But, when I was 15 years old, I walked on stage in my high school play as the Artful Dodger, and like a light went off above my head, and I went, "Oh my God, this is what I'm doing." And 20 years later, 18 years, and anyway, after that initial blush of success that you were just talking about with the Brat Pack and all that stuff sort of started, I started traveling the world. I mentioned I walked across the Camino de Santiago, and I had a real white light experience that first time I did it. I was like early 30s, and I had a real revelation in this field of wheat. I just found myself on my knees sobbing, and I realized in that moment how much fear had dominated my life and played such a large part in my life and all my decisions, and so many of my actions had been motivated by fear. So much so that I wasn't aware of fear's presence in my life until that moment of its first absence. And suddenly in that field of wheat, I felt just like that 15-year-old kid beside the barn. I mean, 15-year-old kid when I walked out on stage at the Artful Dodger, I felt like that light went off above my head, and I felt like, oh my God, there I am again. I feel like me. I just started writing stuff down, and eventually I said, I want to do something with this. So I met an editor, and I got somebody to introduce me to an editor at a magazine. I said, "You ought to let me write for your magazine." And he said, "You're an actor, dude." And I said, "Yeah, but I know how to tell a story. That's what I do for a living." So I became very successful very quickly in travel writing because I knew two things. I knew that, this was in every article I ever wrote, even if I wasn't writing about it, is that travel is a powerful, meaningful tool, and it can change your life in a profound way, like it's changed mine. And I also knew tell a story, don't sell me a destination. And so I would tell stories always in a way, as opposed to talking about the beautiful beach. I couldn't care less about the beach. I came to the beach because I'm going to go pearl diving down there to bring my mother home a pearl for her birthday. That's what it's about, me getting a pearl, not, and it happens to be on a beautiful beach. So I'm not right. You know what I mean? So I'm always trying to tell a story. So that just, and the reason they both happen, because people would always say, like, wait, you're a young movie star and you parlay into becoming a travel writer? This is really downwardly mobile. What are you doing? And I was like, no, to me, they're the same thing. I feel like me when I'm doing it to the most. And so, and then I started directing television because it felt the same way. And I started writing books. I realized the older I got, I loved sitting in a room alone and banging this stuff out and figuring it out. And so they're all kind of the same thing to me. In like, I'm a really bad businessman, but I know that little white light experience when I've had it, the several times I've had it in my life. I've been able, the only gift I have is I've been able to recognize it when it happens. Because, and it's a very small little voice. So the best ideas are usually the quiet little ones floating by, not the loud ones.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. Sometimes either we miss it entirely or we have that moment and we're kind of afraid to go after it because I can't do that. Like what's your advice to people who have that, lack of faith or confidence in themselves to actually pull this off?
Well, I don't have any advice for anyone, but I'll give you an example in my life because what you said was right. The four-letter word there was fear. And I think this fear dominates so many of our things when we don't like to admit fear because fear again is weakness, and or so we perceive. But I was in Brazil, going down the. I was going to go down the Amazon. I was in Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon, middle of Brazil, and I was going to get on this boat and go down the Amazon. And so I went down to the dock in the morning, and it was chaos, bedlam. There are these boats that are tipping in the river, and it looks like they're never going to make it 2 miles. There's hundreds of people with bananas on their shoulders, and they're carrying all sorts of shit, and it's just chaos. And I'm like, there's no way I'm getting on this boat for a week to float down there. I'm never doing that. But and so I'm going back to my hotel. I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going home. Forget this is a fucking terrible idea. So I see that some people are getting on these boats and they're slinging hammocks up, and that's going to be their bed for a week. They're going to just line up hammocks on the dock of these boats, and that's how they travel down the river. So I'm like, well, no way am I doing that. My back would be. So anyway, but I see an old lady selling hammocks, and so I go, well, I want a hammock anyway. Those are beautiful hammocks, and it's only like $5. It's like a couple dollars. I'm going to buy a hammock because that'd be $100 at home. So I buy a hammock. And then I see a guy selling the tickets. The little guy selling the tickets to the boats for like, whatever, $1 or $2. And so I said, well, I mean, I'm here. I'll just buy a ticket because I want to see the boat. The boats look cool. I'm not going on the boat, but I'd like to go. So I buy a ticket and I get on the boat and I just sort of walk around and I'm ready to get off the boat. And then I see this little kid stringing up his hammock and he's like, okay. And I go, and he goes, you want me to help you? And I'm like, without, he's speaking Portuguese. I'm like, yeah, sure, hang on, not so hang. And anyway, long story long, you see where it's all going. And, an hour later, I'm chugging down the Amazon.
Yeah.
And it was just one little incremental step at a time. I was not in any way actively, consciously trying to fool myself. I was just buying a hammock because I wanted a hammock. I just took
Yeah.
a little incremental, tiny step. You know what I mean? And like, I never planned to be a travel writer and then write books. I had no intention of writing books when I was an actor who didn't have a job, so I traveled. And then this
Yeah.
thing happened, and I just poured water on those things.
Well, yeah, what a great um, metaphor for anything that is bigger, like too big to even contemplate. It's just those tiny incremental steps, and the next thing you know, you're doing the thing you were terrified of. That's such an awesome story. Um, Bringing it back to your book and friendship, I wonder, aside from going on a 10,000-mile journey to reconnect with people, what are some things that you see that work for people, for men to stay in contact with their friends or to reignite those friendships that, as you said earlier, oh yeah, no, we're friends. I haven't talked to him in 20 years, but we're friends. Don't worry about it. Like, how do you rekindle that kind of stuff in those kind of baby steps?
Well, I only did one thing right in this thing. I showed up, and I do
Mm,
think, I think that old cliche, 90% of life minimum is physically showing up. Go, you're invited to the wedding. You don't want to go to the wedding. Nobody wants to go to the wedding. Go to the wedding. You know what I mean? Just show up. I really did, and particularly for guys, it's like we know how to do that. Physically, we know how to do. We can drive the 8 hours to drive the kid to college. But I think that the older I get too, the more I realize just showing up really matters. And it's like, and what it said to my friends was like, wow, you really value this. How long a drive have you been driving from? Well, and then it was interesting. It forced us to name these friendships because in going, this, you mean a lot to me. You're important to me. And to be old enough now to be able to say that without shame and kind of go, our friendship has meant a lot to who I am in my life. And so to see you again is meaningful to me. And I really appreciate it. And, Aristotle had the same thing, but friends who can acknowledge that friendship and know it and claim it, it deepens the friendship in a real meaningful way. And I experienced that very much, and I certainly think, because like, what do we got to lose? Why am I not? I met, these two cops in Ohio who were in their 70s. I mentioned him, and he said we recently started saying I love you to each other. I tell my wife I love her. I tell my kids I love them. Why can't I tell my best friend for 60 years I love them? They're not threatened by their masculinity. They're like, you are important to me.
Yeah.
And I just think saying that and owning it is huge. It changes
Yeah.
it changes things. It just does. And we don't do it. Why wouldn't we do it? Because we're afraid emotionally. It's like that's
Right.
ludicrous. At a certain age, if you can't with your dearest friends say, you know what, you're important to me, then my God, we'll be dead soon.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's amazing. How did reconnecting with friends on this journey compare to reconnecting with your fellow actors for when you were making the Brat documentary?
Well, that was interesting. Interesting. These kind of things are both similar in the sense of journeys and going to. Well, that was because the irony of that is we were never really that close, and yet we were perceived and labeled as this kind of group of close friends. And I was very much sort of a loner and a excuse me, solitary young guy. And so going back and seeing these people I hadn't seen in like 30 years I was surprised and delighted how much affection we all had for each other in a way that we didn't when we were young. When we were young, you're scared, you're competitive. There's this kind of thing, this wondrous attention is coming at you, and there's a lot. And so I, in that kind of environment, always tend to withdraw and pull back. So that's what I did. But to go back and see them all again, it made me have not only great affection for them, but great affection for my own youth and the way I always thought I kind of mishandled stuff when I was young. Had I been another type of personality, I might have been able to handle it differently. And it had made me have great compassion for myself, for my younger self. And I was able to also look at these people who I don't know at all. I don't know Demi, I don't know Rob, I don't know Ali, I don't know these people. And yet the part of me knows them very intimately and deeply. I could just look at them. We're the only ones who knew what happened in that, when that attention coming at us and we were labeled that. And so again, there was the feeling of being less alone in it and less isolated in it. And having a shared experience just makes it a much richer one. And it allowed me to enjoy it and realize in a very real way that what a blessing being labeled in the Brat Pack was for me. You know what I mean? People come up to me of a certain generation and they look at me and they start talking to me about those movies and their eyes glaze over and I realize very quickly they're not talking to me. They're talking to their own youth. And then in that moment, and I represent that for them. I'm their avatar of youth, and so they can just, and all I have to do is receive them. And it's a beautiful gift to be able to give them. And they give me a beautiful gift.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Do you look at, the sort of new crop of young talent out there and want to tell them anything, or this is just a journey of self-discovery and they'll figure it out?
No one listens. Why would you tell anyone anything? Your own kids, they don't listen. They learn by what we do. I realized, to bring it back to the book for a sec, I realized one of my great failings as a parent was that I didn't have active friendship demonstrated for my children. You know what I mean? My wife is very active and has her friends all the time. But I realized what a failing it was for me as a parent that I didn't demonstrate that. Because like we were just joking, kids, nobody listens. Kids don't listen to us. They do see behavior modeled and learn from that, And it was a real sad revelation for me when I realized, oh, wow, I really failed them as a parent. Not only myself was I failing and not maintaining these friends, but I was failing them. So that was interesting. But
Yeah.
the young actors, like, I don't even know who they are, dude.
Right. Okay. Got it. Got it. Well, this book, I mean, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it. I'm personally jealous of your life as a travel writer because I journeying around the world and seeing different things, and I love the way you approach it. Whether you're doing something, you're not just going to look at something. It's so awesome.
No, thanks, man. Really enjoyed it.
So we have a what we call the speed round of this show. So I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions. So, what is a habit that you are happy to have and one you wish you could ditch?
Well, I wish I could ditch picking my nails, which I'm
Okay.
intermittent my whole life. And I've given my children the bad habit too. Habit I'm happy to have is getting up very early.
Okay, great. What is something that most people love but you secretly can't stand?
Oh, this is such a good question, and I'm sure there are a lot of things, and I can't think of a single one. Come, I'll come back to that one. Give me
We'll
another.
come back to that. Pass, pass. Um, what is your favorite way to turn off your brain?
Going to sleep.
Okay. And has that ever been falling asleep? A lot of people are tortured by that notion. Is it? Do you have a?
No,
Has
I
that
fall
ever been
asleep
a
pretty
problem?
well. I fall asleep pretty well. Yeah.
Uh,
How do I turn off my brain? Listening to music turns off my brain, and walking turns off my brain largely. If I walk myself out of my. I think walking brings us back to our natural rhythm. I'm a massive walker.
what's playing on the radio when you're off on these giant journeys?
Usually nothing. It's when my head sort of processes and downloads and does that.
Oh, okay, great. And then finally, you're flipping through the channels. Pretty in Pink and Weekend and Bernie's
No
are on
contest, Bernie. No
opposite
contest.
channel.
No contest, Bernie.
Bernie, all
Come
right.
on.
That's the answer we were looking for.
I was in a hotel about 6 months ago, and I clicked on the TV and I dropped the thing, and I went into the bathroom and I heard talking, and I'm like, what is that? I know that. And I came out, and it was Bernie was on, and I tell you, I sat there and I watched the last 20 minutes. I haven't seen it in years, and I watched the last 20 minutes when there's the ridiculous boat stuff, and I was laughing my brains out in this hotel room alone, going, "Oh my God, I was so funny." It's
Do
genius,
you
that movie. It's absolutely genius.
absolutely, absolutely. Do you get approached by people pretending to hold up a dead person next to them?
Dude, so many times. And everybody thinks they're the first one to do it. You know what I mean? And then they'll come up to me with the Pretty in Pink on. Blaine, that's not a name. That's a major appliance. Has anyone ever said that to you? And I'm like, yeah, every fucking day. You know? So, but what I love is that people think that no one's ever done this before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
That's
it's
great.
great though, 'cause really all they're doing is wanting to connect, which is delicious.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, hey, so great talking to you. Thank you for all the laughs over the decades and for these great books. As you mentioned, um, Who Needs Friends is out now, so you can pick it up anywhere. So, Andrew McCarthy, thanks so much, man.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.